My Weird School Special, Book Number 9. The Leprechaun is Finally Gone. Written by Dan Gutman. Pictures by Jim Pellot. Chapter 1. Jake the Snake. My name is AJ, and I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that you're reading this book. You're thinking that you're reading this sentence. Now you're thinking that you're reading this sentence. And now you're thinking that you're reading this sentence. But what if you're not reading this book at all? What if you're really asleep right now and you're dreaming that you're reading this book? Or what if this book is really reading you? Or what if you're really holding a magic chicken in your hands that can turn itself into the shape of a book and you're reading a chicken? Okay, that would be weird. The point is, it was March. And you know what that means? St. Patrick's Day. It was just 1 week away. Our class was sitting in the book nook of the library at elementary school. It was story time with our librarian, Mrs. Rupee. She was finishing a picture book called The Legend of St. Patrick. And that's the story of how St. Patrick drove the snakes out of Ireland, read Mrs. Rupee. She closed the book and we all clapped, because that's what you're supposed to do when anybody finishes anything. Nobody knows why. Any questions? Asked Mrs. Rupee. Andrea Young, this annoying girl with curly brown hair, raised her hand. Of course, Andrea always raises her hand. I bet that the minute she was born, the first thing Andrea did was raise her hand to ask the doctor a question. Yes, Andrea? Asked Mrs. Rupee. Well, I'm half Irish, Andrea said. Which half? I asked. Top or bottom? Arlo, shouted Andrea. She calls me by my real name because she knows I don't like it. Left or right half? I asked. Please let Andrea speak, AJ, said Mrs. Rupee. My mother told me that the story about St. Patrick never really happened, said Andrea. He didn't drive the snakes out of Ireland. My mother said they didn't even have snakes in Ireland back in those days. Mrs. Rupee said as she wrinkled up her forehead. Grown-ups always say, and wrinkle up their foreheads when they don't know what to say. Nobody knows why. But then Mrs. Rupee smiled. Wait a minute, she said excitedly. This is a teachable moment. Oh no, a boring moment is more like it. Grown-ups love teachable moments. That means they get to teach us stuff, and we have to learn stuff. Learning stuff is no fun. That's why I hate teachable moments. We can do research, Mrs. Rupee said as she went over to the computer. We can find out if St. Patrick really drove the snakes out of Ireland. Let's look it up. Oh no, not research. That's the worst kind of teachable moment. Mrs. Rupee loves doing research. She would spend the whole day looking stuff up if she could. My parents told me that in ancient times, before the internet, primitive humans couldn't just look stuff up on a computer or smartphone. If they wanted to know something, they had to go to the library. Can you imagine? So, in the olden days, only smart people knew stuff. These days, any dope can look stuff up on a phone and pretend to be smart. It used to be easy to tell who was smart. The smart people knew lots of stuff. Now it's harder to tell who's smart, because any dope can look up everything. Anyway, Mrs. Rupee didn't have the chance to look anything up on the computer because You'll never believe who poked her head into the door at that moment. Nobody! Why would you poke your head into a door? That would hurt. But you'll never believe who poked her head into the doorway. It was Mrs. Patty, our school secretary. She had a basket in one hand. Mrs. Patty, said Mrs. Rupee, to what do we owe the pleasure of your company? That's grown-up talk for, what are you doing here? I heard you talking about St. Patrick driving the snakes out of Ireland, said Mrs. Patty. Would you kids like to see something cool? Yes, we all shouted. And you'll never believe in 1,100,000 years what Mrs. Patty was carrying in her basket. It was a snake. Eek! Screamed Michael, who never ties his shoes. Help! Shouted Alexia, this girl who rides a skateboard all the time. Run for your lives! Shouted Neil, who we call the nude kid even though he wears clothes. There's nothing to be afraid of, said Mrs. Patty. This is my pet snake, Jake. He's my baby. Huh? We all said, which is also huh backward. Who keeps a snake as a pet? It was ridiculous. Mrs. Patty is batty. One Halloween we went trick-or-treating at her house. Mrs. Patty had her husband Marvin's head in a bucket down in the basement. But that's a story for another day. I love St. Patrick's Day, said Mrs. Patty. In fact, my parents were born in Ireland, and they named me Patty after St. Patrick. That snake is scary, whimpered Emily, who's scared of everything. Does Jake the snake bite? Asked Ryan, who will eat anything, even stuff that isn't food. Of course not, said Mrs. Patty. He doesn't have to. He swallows things whole. What? Just kidding, said Mrs. Patty. He's an eastern hog-nosed snake. They hardly ever bite. Jake likes people. Who wants to touch him? I do, said Andrea. I do, I said. Ooh, said Ryan. AJ and Andrea both said I do. That's what people say when they get married. AJ and Andrea must be in love, said Michael. If those guys weren't my best friends, I would hate them.